Okay. Just a few more in the waiting room and then we'll start. Okay, everyone. Well, welcome to the 8th episode of Digging In Season 2. I'm Lindsay Randall, the host of the speaker series. And Digging In is a series of live presentations with archaeologists from around the country, co-sponsored by the Robert S. Peabody Institute of Archaeology and the Massachusetts Archaeological Society. Join us every other Wednesday at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time through June for our presentations. For a schedule of dates and presenters, please visit us at peabody.andover.edu or at the Massachusetts Archaeological Society's Facebook page. And if you enjoy our programming, consider expanding your impact by becoming a member of the Massachusetts Archaeological Society. We are able to bring you outstanding programming through support of viewers like you. Today, we are very excited to welcome Dr. Kyera Singleton. Kyera Singleton is the Executive Director of the Royall House and Slave Quarters Museum. She is also a PhD candidate at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, in the Department of American Culture. Currently, she is on dissertation completion fellowship in the History Department at Harvard University. And before joining the History Department as a dissertation fellow, she held prestigious academic fellowships from the Benecke Foundation, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, Emory University's James Weldon Johnson Institute for the Study of Race and Difference, and the American Association of University Women. From 2018 through 2019, she served as the Humanity and Action Policy Fellow for the ACLU of Georgia, where she worked on various issues, including mass incarceration, reproductive justice, and voting rights. And as a public history scholar, Kyera Singleton currently serves as an advisor on the Boston Arts Commission's Recontextualization Subcommittee for the Bronze Emancipation Group statue. She also is a member of the Board of Public Humanities Fellows at Brown University, which brings together a collection of museum leaders from Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. And remember, at the conclusion of the talk, viewers are able to submit questions directly to me via the chat function, either at the bottom of your screen or at the side of your Zoom screen. And then we will give our speaker time to answer as many as she can, with the understanding we might not get to all of them. So welcome, Kyera, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here with you all today and to speak about the work that we're doing over at the Royall House in slave quarters. And I am just going to get the presentation started by sharing my PowerPoint, and then I'll just launch into the talk. All right, again, my name is Kyera Singleton. I am not quite a doctor yet, though. Whenever anyone calls me a doctor, it feels like an extra push and gives me a little bit of hope that I am close to the finish line. So thank you for that, Lindsay. Today, I'm going to talk to you all about what goes into telling a complex story about the history of slavery in New England through talking about the work that we do at our site, the Royall House and Slave Quarters. So I'm not sure if many of you have had a chance to visit the museum or if you know anything about us. So I'll give a brief overview during the course of the talk, but one of the things that I really want to highlight today as well is because I happen to be doing this talk at the start of Preservation History Month, right? And so one of the things, I think the theme for this year is to tell a full American story. And I think our site does a really good job at doing that and contending with the complexities of what goes into preserving historic sites, while at the same time thinking about how do you tell stories that are often painful, to tell stories that are often, I think, hard for people to think through when it comes to the history of slavery and centering the lives of the enslaved people. That so many historic sites throughout, not only throughout New England, but throughout the country, have to contend with on a daily basis. This is a shot of our museum. As you can see, you have this grand mansion to my left, and then behind it you have the slave quarters. Now, what's really, really important about our site is that we have the only known standing slave quarters in New England. Now, I want to contextualize that just a bit because there are a lot of sites that have a history connected to enslavement, but we have the only known freestanding slave quarters. And when I say freestanding, that is really important because these slave quarters were used for the sole purpose of housing enslaved people, as well as for the labor that enslaved people did on our site. Now, the mansion is also slave quarters, right? Enslaved people lived there as well. And so many historic sites do have slave quarters when you consider kind of the main homes as the site of enslavement. So I just wanted to contextualize that just a bit. So my first introduction to the Royall House and slave quarters was in the summer of 2019. I happened to be in town for an academic conference in which we were all encouraged to take a tour of the Royall House and slave quarters by Dr. Kendra Field, who is the co-director of the African American Trail Project at Tufts University. As a scholar who is deeply invested in the history of slavery, and as someone who grew up in New Jersey, I was simultaneously shocked and intrigued to learn that there remained standing slave quarters in the North. I immediately pulled out my phone to Google the site, and the description read as follows. In the 18th century, the Royall House and slave quarters was home to the largest slaveholding family in Massachusetts and the enslaved Africans who made their lavish way of life possible. Today, the Royall House and slave quarters is a museum whose architecture, household items, archaeological artifacts, and programs bear witness to intertwined stories of wealth and bondage set against the backdrop of America's quest for independence. So I immediately gathered a group of my friends and we went on a tour to the Royall House and slave quarters. And in many ways, my initial shock at there being freestanding slave quarters in the North quickly turned into a deep admiration for how careful the site dealt with the history of slavery and how important it was to center enslaved people in the telling of the story. So I'm going to begin my talk with a poem that I like to start with. It's called On Sullivan's Island, and it's a poem by Georgia Author of the Year and Cave Canem poet Malcolm Tariq. He writes, I heed a path trodden for me before. I am this impaired, forgetting and forgetting and forgetting. What else is this wave crashing into shore but an attempt to cleave remembrance? Overhead, the dark sky engulfs the low country, once welcomed spot and terror for the ancestors, always a nest for the captors. Now, baby strollers and casual dog walks file before a single marquee meant to hold place for history, leisure where once labor. What work have I come here to do besides witness? I go from shore to shore seeking clarity, to stand on the threshold of past and present, where land and sea court death. I search my mind for what remains of generational sanity. There is nothing but bondage. So I really wanted to start with that poem because I think when we think about the legacy of slavery in the North, I want to begin with thinking about the violence of forgetting, of not seeing. The legacy of slavery is all around us. It manifests in our very built environments, the land we walk, the monuments on display, the institutions we teach in, and for me, quite literally in the museum I lead. Although slavery existed in Massachusetts and in the North more generally, we often celebrate and talk about the North's legacy of abolitionism, and in particular, white abolitionism. Yet slavery was an important part of Northern society. Scholar Wendy Warren estimates that by the 1670s, more than half of the ships in Boston's harbor were going to and from the West Indies. This is important because I think people look at the region as a whole and say, well, there weren't as many enslaved people here, but numbers obscure the truth. Scholars such as Jared Hardesty shows that while enslaved people made up 4% of New England's population, in the 18th century, when you look at places such as Boston, that number actually fluctuates between 12 and 15%. And if you were to go to neighboring Rhode Island, that number jumps to 25%. So slavery was important to New England's economy. You have in the 19th century, it's important to acknowledge the indigenous populations who were here before colonists came and colonized. And so you have in the 17th century, colonists coming and enslaving and stealing land from indigenous people throughout the region, and actually using that land to cultivate food and to supply timber and other goods that were necessary to help sugarcane plantations function in the West Indies. You even have people like John Winthrop, who sent his sons to start plantations in Barbados. So it's really important that, you know, as we're talking about the museum and going to get into archaeology, you know, to think about how land was actually used, to think about what was on the site before the Royal House and Slave Quarters came into being. So I mentioned John Winthrop, who sent his sons over to start plantations in Barbados. It's important because in many ways, that's how we kind of get to our museum, the Royal House and Slave Quarters. So Tin Hills Farm, which was the land that the Royal House and Slave Quarters used to sit on, was a 500-acre estate, and Isaac Royall Jr. purchased it in 1732. And it was previously owned by John Winthrop. In 1737, Isaac Royall Jr. returned to his native New England after amassing a fortune on the Caribbean island of Antigua. In his 2 decades in Antigua, he had sold about 274 enslaved people. So for nearly 4 decades, the family's lavish lifestyles and the operations of their working farm depended on enslaved Africans, some of whom came over with the family from Antigua. More than 60 men, women, and children were held in bondage on the property between 1737 and the start of the American Revolution. So that's just like a quick kind of overview of the background history to how we get to the Royal House and Slave Quarters. And I want to now talk about how we do the work that we do at the Royal House and Slave Quarters. So when most people have heard about the Royal House and Slave Quarters, they have heard about the history and connection to the American Revolution. I mentioned that it is National Preservation Month and National Historic Preservation Month. And one of the reasons why I think it is important to think about that is kind of thinking about the reasons why sites like the Royal House and Slave Quarters are preserved. They were not preserved to talk about the history of slavery. In many ways, they were preserved to talk about American patriotism, to display, the fancy architecture, to talk about the men and women who were enslavers, but to talk about their societal connections. And so when we get to our site, the royal family, they were very, very well known because they were prominent members of society. Isaac Royall Jr. sits on the governor's council. Many of you probably know that when he passes away, he bequeaths a certain amount of money that is then used to help fund the law school and establish the royal professorship of law, of the Royal Chair of Professorship at Harvard Law School. So it's really important when we think about all of these connections that we're doing a lot of work when we say that it is important to center the lives of enslaved people, because it's so easy, right, to not center them and to focus on the people who were enslavers versus the people who helped build the wealth. So, and one of the ways that we try to decenter the royal family at our site is literally through archival documents. So right now, I just have up an image of an inventory that was done of Isaac Royall's property in the 1730s, and it lists a lot of the furniture that the family owned, as well as enslaved people. So you have a Negro man named Fortune there. You have another listing of 4 other enslaved people. And then if you were, this is not the, old historical documents are not always the clearest, but if you were to look, if we were to have a closer up image, you have cups and chairs and other items listed on the inventory. And so when we think about how the story was originally told of the Royal House and slave quarters, people often talked about all of the possessions that the family had. But if you look at the document, right next to the possessions, right next to the objects and artifacts are enslaved people. And it's important that we talk about enslaved people and center their history. So when you first come into the museum, one of my favorite panels that hangs on the wall is this one that says "Enslaved on the Royal Estate," and it lists the names of the 60-some women, men, and children that we know were once enslaved by the royal family. Now, we might not have a ton of information on every single person, but we feel it is our duty to list the information that we do know. And if it's a name, we list the name. If we have more information on different individuals, then that is also a part of the story. But for many people that we know about who were enslaved on the royal estate, we only have a first name, except for Belinda Sutton, who I'll talk about a little bit later. So now I'm going to take you into a few spaces of the museum. Right now, you are looking at the winter kitchen. And inside of the winter kitchen, which you see stage, you have milk pans, you have candlesticks in the back. If you look in the corner, that's kind of adjacent to the chair, we have a ton of burlap sacks, and those are to represent the enslaved people who we know were on the inventory and listed as sleeping in the kitchen. So we know that there are Negro beds and bedding in the kitchen because that is what is on the inventory. And so you come into the kitchen and you look and you see in the background all of that pewter, which is a indication of the wealth that the royal family had. But then you're also confronted with the fact that you are in a space of labor. You're in a space of compelled labor, that enslaved people are not only sleeping in this kitchen, but they're also, imagine, working around the clock to make sure that food is getting prepared for the royal family, to make sure that candles are being made, to make sure that milk is getting churned, that cream is getting skimmed. These are all a part of kind of their daily activities. And the reason why we have these milk pans and different artifacts staged throughout the kitchen is because this is what we know. We know that this was in the kitchen based on the inventories. So another space that I'm going to take you into the museum is the kitchen chamber. And this room is right above the kitchen, which is why it's named the kitchen chamber. And the inventory tells us that this room was used for a bunch of different uses. We know that enslaved people slept in this room because on the inventory, it lists 2 Negro beds and bedding. We also know that the room was used for storage because there were trunks that were listed on the inventory. We know that enslaved women most likely used this as a workspace to mend and make clothing because the inventory listed that this room had different fabric as well as different trunks. So we know that this space was used for many different purposes. One of the other interesting things about this room is that we know that it most likely also was a dressing room. And the reason why we know that is because the inventory tells us that there's a looking glass. And so most likely what would happen is before a big party, Isaac Royall Jr., who threw a lot of lavish parties, would come in here, get dressed, have an enslaved person put on his powdered wig before he would go out and entertain. And one of the things that I want to highlight, I think, about this space as well is that you can see how bare the walls are. And I want you to remember that when I talk a little bit about the marble chamber. So this talk is for archaeology. So I really want to spend a lot of time to talk about the archaeological findings as well that are on our site. Between 1999 and 2001, led by Dr. Alexander Chan at Boston University, we underwent an archaeological dig. And during this dig, we uncovered about 55,000 pieces of artifacts that have led to the reinterpretation of the museum. So a few of these artifacts we use to really talk and highlight interiority, leisure, and resistance. So one of the things that we do not want to do at the museum is we don't want people to come and only learn about the labor that enslaved people did. That is really important, but one of the things we want to make sure we do is to not make violence necessarily like the cornerstone of enslaved people's history necessarily. That as violent as enslavement is, we want to also make sure that people understand that enslaved people were resisting on a daily basis, and they were resisting in both large and smaller ways. And so one of the ways that we often talk about is the use of game pieces and marbles in order for enslaved families to participate in leisure. So on my right, what you see are game pieces and marbles. So we know that these tiles were fashioned into game pieces by enslaved people on site. And then marbles were also found as well. And so we believe that these were used to play games that enslaved families would gather at points during the day to spend time with their family, to spend time with the other enslaved people who were held on our site in order to, create moments of downtime for themselves. Now, it's really important that we talk about these game pieces and these marbles because they were found during the archaeological dig directly in front of the slave quarters. And what's important about that is that they were found outside in a yard that was not actually in view from the main house. So we can have a whole conversation about how enslaved people found time for privacy and how they made moments for themselves and how they probably stole moments away from the labor that they were compelled to do on a daily basis. And I want to also be careful to not make it seem as though, resistance is a very easy thing for enslaved people. We have to always remember that enslaved people are resisting, but they're resisting their autonomy being stripped away from them, right? So we can't talk about resistance without talking about the violence of slavery. To my left, what you see is an amulet. And we know that a large segment of the enslaved people who were once held on our site were most likely from West Africa via the West Indies, Antigua to be more specific. And these amulets were used as a source of protection. And they also represent native religious practices that enslaved people maintained despite their enslavement and despite being introduced to different religions such as Christianity. And so these artifacts are a part of the way in which we tell the story of enslaved people on our site. And we have other artifacts that were uncovered, such as like the milk pans that I showed you earlier, and the slave quarters in the winter kitchen. And we know that a bunch of those milk pans and cream pots were actually found directly near the slave quarters. And so a part of how we have interpreted the site is that while the slave quarters were also used for sleeping spaces, enslaved women, men, and children also worked there. And so we believe that the slave quarters doubled as a dairy and also a space in which different forms of labor were happening, such as washing and ironing, in addition to just being sleeping quarters for enslaved people. So another artifact that I want to talk about in general, which as a historian, we think about a lot about archival records, right? And although it's not an artifact in the traditional sense, one of the things that we have from the 18th century, which is really special, is a petition from Belinda Sutton, which was launched in 1783. Now, I mentioned that Isaac Royall Jr. Isaac Royall Jr. inherited the site from his father, Isaac Royall Sr., after his father passed away, and he became the most well-known of the royal family because, as I mentioned, he was a part of the governor's council. He amassed a ton of property throughout Massachusetts, and he was a businessman. He owned taverns and different businesses. And so when he passed away in 1781, in his will, there was a woman, Belinda, who he gave the option to either be enslaved by his daughter or to gain her freedom. Of course, Belinda Sutton chooses her freedom. And in 1783, she launches a petition for a pension from the royal estate, in which she asks to be compensated for the labor that was compelled from her for the benefit of the royal family, in which she never ever received any payment for. So I'm just going to read a portion of the 1783 petition, because it is unlike many documents, petitions that are launched in the 18th century. Usually those petitions are freedom petitions, but this document is actually advocating for a financial compensation. So many scholars have called this actually one of the first instances of reparations that we have in this country. So the petition of Belinda, an African, humbly shows that 70 years have rolled away since she, on the banks of the Rio de Volta, received her existence. She was ravished from the bosom of her country, from the arms of her friends, while the advanced age of her parents, rendering them unfit for servitude, cruelly separated her from them forever. She learned to catch the ideas marked by the sounds of language, only to know that her doom was slavery, from which death alone was to emancipate her. And though she was a free moral agent, accountable for her actions, she never had a moment at her own disposal. 50 years her faithful hands have been compelled to ignoble servitude for the benefit of an Isaac Royall, while she, by the laws of the land, is denied the enjoyment of one morsel of that immense wealth, a part whereof hath been accumulated by her own industry, and the whole augmented by her servitude. She prays that such an allowance be made out to her from the estate of Colonel Royall, as will prevent her and her more infirm daughter from misery, and she will ever pray. So at the time of the petition, Belinda was living in Boston, and we know that she was illiterate because she signs the petition with an X, indicating that she couldn't read or write. And we believe that the initial petition was drafted by Prince Hall, who was a prominent leader of Boston's free Black community in the 18th century. So what's really remarkable about this petition is that she actually won. She was awarded annual payments of about 15 pounds and 12 shillings. However, after the first payment, she had to go back to court 5 more times over the course of a decade in order to receive payment, because the payments were regularly missed. And she petitioned up until the 1790s when she passed away. And so we know that she was never able to receive all of the money that was owed to her, yet she continuously petitioned Massachusetts. And a part of this is for us to think about, what does it mean to leave a record behind? And how do we talk about how enslaved people left records behind? And we can do that through the actual artifacts that are left behind, as well as historical documents and archival documents, such as Belinda's petition, that really forces us to think about how enslaved people negotiated enslavement, as well as advocating for slavery, advocating for the end of legalized slavery in Massachusetts. And I want to end by saying that Belinda launches her petition in 1783. And 2 months after she submits her petition, the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court actually abolishes legalized slavery. And now we know that slavery continues in many ways, but it's really important to think about Belinda and a community of Black abolitionists who were defining freedom on their own terms. And I think when we think about resistance, you have petitions such as this one, but you also have the everyday acts of resistance that I talked about earlier, in terms of stilling moments for leisure through examining the tiles that were turned into game pieces that were left behind as archaeological evidence. So I'm going to end here, and I will gladly take any questions you all may have.
Yes, so please send in any questions to the chat function. Already a few. In New England, there is the dominant narrative, when slavery is even acknowledged of having happened here, that it wasn't as bad as Southern slavery. And can you talk more about how wrong that assumption is?
Yeah, so when people say that it wasn't bad as Southern slavery, it's important to kind of push back against that, because slavery is, inhumane. It is immoral. If people assume that slavery was more benevolent in the North, then there's an assumption that enslavers treated enslaved people well. And we have to remember that slavery is about the theft of labor, right? And that racial stereotypes are used to justify the theft of labor. So when we think about this country's wealth, we have to acknowledge that it is built upon the slave trade, and that it is the trying to strip people of their humanity in order to build one's wealth. And so slavery as an institution is just terrible, there's no way around it. There's no such thing as a benevolent enslaver. There's no such thing as a good form of slavery. There's just no such thing, because we're talking about human beings who were forced into an unnatural condition. And so, yeah, I think that myth is pervasive, because we don't have in New England, generally large scale plantations. The Royall House and slave quarters is an exception. But in general, most enslaved people lived in homes that had maybe 3 or 4 other enslaved people. And so I think people think that, it was a nicer arrangement, but no, there's nothing, good about slavery. You can't choose where you live. You can't choose what you wear. You can't choose what you eat. You can't choose to get married. You're forced to be illiterate. You have no control, in general over your legal personhood. So it's a terrible formulation
Yes.
in so many ways.
So another question is, for the archaeological material, how do people go about accessing them or seeing them? Where are they located?
Yeah, so if you come on our site, we have some of that material actually is housed at our site in the slave quarters. And so if you were to come and visit, you would go into the slave quarters and you would see two cases of artifacts that really tell the story of bounty and bondage. So that what you would see is that you would see fancy wine bottles that have the royal family's seal stamped onto them. And then in another case, you would see the artifacts that help us tell the stories and the stories of enslaved people. And you see kind of the milk pans, or you would see the game pieces and the tiles. So most of them are, not most of them, a lot of them are on display at our site. There are some that are at Boston University, and then the rest is controlled by the state of Massachusetts.
Okay. Another question is, in terms of other organizations in the area, kind of going back to very similar to the other one in terms of New England likes to ignore our history of slavery. How are you seeing other organizations who might not have archaeological collections that directly speak to it? How are they talking about slavery or changing how they talk or things like that?
Well, I think what I've started to see is that there are a lot of sites who are now starting to explore their connections to slavery, and people are starting to do research on their sites. So a lot of people are at the very beginning of this work. Some people have been doing it for a while, but I think a lot of people are just launching research projects to get into the archives to see what's there. What are there documents that talk about slavery in relation to their site? And most likely when you start to dig around in the archive, you're going to find it. And so I think even if you do not have archaeology that can help tell the story of slavery, I think before we even got to the archaeological aspect, we started to do the research to unearth that there was slavery on the site, which then prompted an archaeological dig.
Okay. We have another question. Was the kitchen part of the main house or a separate building as at Washington's Mount Vernon plantation?
Yeah, so there are actually two kitchens. The one that I showed you is the winter kitchen, and that is a part of the main house. And enslaved people would have mostly used that space during the colder months. And the slave quarters, attached to the slave quarters actually is a summer kitchen, and that would have been used in the hotter months.
Is that the brick side?
Yeah, that's the brick side of the slave quarters. And what's really, really important about that is that the kitchen, the two kitchens, actually the distance between the slave quarters and the main house is about 35 feet away.
Okay. Well, those were the questions we had. Thank you, Kyera. Dr. Singleton, I'm going to call you that. So for everyone else, thank you for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you at our next lecture, which is on Wednesday, May 19th, when we are joined by Dr. Kelly Britt, who will be speaking about archaeology and activism. And again, we rely on the support of viewers like you, so consider supporting our outreach by becoming a member of the Massachusetts Archaeological Society, and also consider becoming a member of the Royal House and Slave Quarters Museum, because we all need our support, especially right now during COVID. Are you guys open yet for tours or anything like that?
We are not open yet for tours. We're hoping to open later in the summer. So you should all look out for an announcement sometime in June about when we'll be reopening. But you can stay up to date with us by going to our website at royalhouse.org. And you'll be able to subscribe to our newsletter and find out all of the information there. And you can also become members. So
yes, and their newsletters are really good. They just sent one out today. So and everything. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Singleton, again. So everyone have a good Wednesday. Thank you.
bye.